I was born and raised in Cheyenne, Wyoming. My family is an upper-middle-class family. My father is a rancher, and my mother worked right along with him and took care of me and my older sister. Growing up, I always knew that not only did we have a good life, but I knew that I was extremely lucky. Being a cowgirl was never something I chose. It's just a part of me. It was a lot of hard work, and it might sound like a bad thing to someone else, or like I didn't have a proper childhood because of it. But the only thing that I had ever wanted to be since I can remember was a rancher, no matter how much hard work and training it would take. Meanwhile, my mother and father decided to send me off to live at a ranch company one summer, over in Laramie. It's basically a summer program for kids who are raised on ranches all over the country to learn more about ranching. Most kids who go plan to continue their family's ranches and are super dedicated to it. At first, I was pretty bummed out about going, but when I thought about it, this was the perfect opportunity to get away for a little while without getting too far away from home. Once at the school, it didn't take me too long to settle into a routine. It was a lot like home, and we started our days at 5 a.m. sharp every morning by feeding all the animals and doing any necessary cleaning that needed done around the ranch house or out in one of the pastures. Luke, the ranch hand assigned to me, always made fun of me because even though I knew how, he didn't like some of my ranching techniques and said I came off as unprofessional. I honestly think he may have just liked me a bit and was trying to get my attention. Of course, I figured I would show him that I did know what I was doing. And one day I decided to head out for morning chores earlier than everyone else. So one morning I got up at 4:30 a.m. to get a jump start and be the first one there. It was still pretty dark outside, but I grabbed my stuff and headed out to the barns, where most of the animals were waiting expectantly inside their pens or stalls for us to come to them. I opened all the gates and went around unlocking all the barn doors and feeding troughs, filling them with hay, doing it all in the correct order in the way I did it at home. After that, I had to feed all the horses in their stalls, which is always a bigger job than expected, especially for one person. Then while heading out of one of the large pig enclosure fences, which were made of barbed wire and metal posts, something caught my eye. It was hard to see it clearly, but there seemed to be some sort of creature just outside of the enclosure on the other side of the fence, and it was staring towards me. It looked like a dog, but not really. In fact, I couldn't really tell what it was, except that it seemed bigger than a normal dog. Curiously, I walked towards it, gently calling out to it, thinking that maybe it was just a dog I hadn't met yet, and so that I could get close enough to see exactly what it was. As soon as I got close, the creature suddenly let out an extremely loud shriek, followed by a howl which stopped me in my tracks. What animal makes that kind of noise? Immediately after it made these noises, I heard something else scream from behind me. I turned around. There were 3 more of them running straight towards me. Had this one called out to these other 3? The other crazy thing about all of this was that the ones running towards me were only using their 2 back legs. And before I knew what was happening, they were in the enclosure with me and had sideswiped me to the ground. And then the last thought that went through my mind before everything went black was that I might die in this moment. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, it was daylight. It couldn't have been too awful long though, because I was still the only one out there. But that wasn't going to be the case for long. I got to my feet as fast as I could and sprinted towards the farmhouse, hoping that someone already up would hear me screaming for help. When I reached the house, Luke was running out along with 3 or 4 other guys. They had all heard me screaming and were out there to make sure I was okay. When they saw me over by the gate, however, their faces went as white as ghosts. They all just stood there staring at me like deer caught in headlights. What was that? Who were those things? I almost wanted to start crying knowing that I had maybe seen someone I wasn't supposed to, and they weren't going to tell me what. That's what the look on their faces was saying. I started to catch my breath from running so fast, and that's when I saw it. To my horror, all the pens and stalls that surrounded the enclosure looked like they had been exploded apart. There was hay everywhere, and much of the pen fencing was flat on the ground. We all stood there in silence trying to assess what had happened. All I could remember was seeing those dog creatures, and then blackness. I can't tell you how much I wished in that moment that I hadn't been so stubborn about proving my worth. I just should have stayed in bed. Many of the animals were missing and others were injured. The dog creatures had somehow gotten into the enclosure and were more vicious than I could have ever imagined. All through this, Luke had a strange look on his face, like shock. I walked up to him to apologize, and he stared back at me with the most intense look. He said that these animals had done this sort of damage before. He had never experienced it firsthand because it was many years in the past. But within the inner circle of the ranch, it's a well-known fact that dogmen live in the area. He looked at me and surprised me by not being mad, but by saying that all he cared about was that I was safe. It turns out that the past encounter hadn't turned out well for the person who had the encounter. What happened was that he was so scared he couldn't think properly and lost control of his tractor. He drove the tractor at high speed straight into another piece of equipment, and that was that for him. After my encounter, many of the other ranch hands were coming forward to tell me their stories too. One guy even said he had seen a creature before, but only in the dark, and that it was easy to mistake it for a dog if you didn't know better. Only much larger than any dog in existence. I couldn't believe how many people believed my story and had personal stories of their own. It's like it's an unspoken thing out here, but my encounter and me talking about it made them all open up too. Also, I was pretty young at the time, and having other people back me up and believe me has made all the difference. I'm still affected, but I can only imagine how much worse it would be if no one had believed me. All through the years, dogmen have been talked about in many countries and many cultures. How can anyone not think they're real? I personally think it's time that the world knows dogmen for what they really are. Smart and cunning creatures that can hide from you right under your nose. And they're wild. They might have human features and eyes that show how smart they are. But in the end, they're still wild. And I think they want us gone from what they see as their territory. Just please pray you don't run into one where you are. It's honestly not safe. Don't let anyone tell you differently. I grew up in a small town called Truckee, located in the mountains just north of Lake Tahoe. My family owned a cabin on the western shore of the lake, a place that had been in our family for generations. Summers were spent swimming, fishing, and exploring the forest that surrounded the lake. It was a quiet, peaceful life, and I always felt a deep connection to the area. Even as I got older and friends began drifting away to bigger cities and more exciting lives, I never wanted to leave Tahoe. It was home. One summer, just after I graduated from high school, I took a job working at a marina on the lake. The work wasn't glamorous, mostly maintaining the rental boats and helping tourists, but it kept me close to the water, and I got to spend my days outside. My boss, Sam, was an old family friend, and he let me take one of the boats out after hours whenever I wanted. Most evenings, I'd finish up my shift, grab some fishing gear, and head out to one of the quieter spots on the lake to unwind. One evening in late August, the sky was clear and the lake was unusually calm. The tourists had all gone home for the day, and I had the water to myself. I decided to head out to a secluded cove on the northern side of the lake, a spot I'd always liked because it was out of the way and rarely visited by anyone else. The sun was just starting to set, casting a golden glow over the water as I dropped anchor and settled in with my fishing rod. I had been sitting there for about an hour, enjoying the solitude and the occasional tug on the line, when I noticed something odd. The water around my boat, which had been perfectly still, began to ripple gently, almost as if something was moving just below the surface. At first, I didn't think much of it, maybe a large fish or even a stray current, but the ripples grew stronger, spreading out in a way that didn't seem natural. Curious, I leaned over the side of the boat, peering into the clear water. The light was fading, and it was getting harder to see, but I could just make out a dark shape moving beneath the surface. It was large, much larger than any fish I'd ever seen in the lake, and it was coming closer to the boat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shape was too big to be a fish, at least any fish I knew of, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was terrifying to watch. As it approached, the water began to churn, and suddenly, something broke the surface. At first, I thought it was a log or some debris, but then I saw it. long, scaled, and greenish-black, like the hide of a crocodile but much smoother. It was a tail, or at least that's what it looked like, and it was attached to something big, something that was now rising out of the water. In the fading light, I could barely make out its form, a long, sinuous body, covered in scales that shimmered like oil on water, and a head that was both reptilian and disturbingly intelligent. The creature's eyes, large and glowing faintly in the twilight, locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of primal fear wash over me. This thing wasn't just an animal. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong in the world as I knew it. I tried to move, to back away from the edge of the boat, mesmerized by the sight of this monstrous creature. It slowly circled the boat, its body undulating beneath the water, never breaking eye contact. I could hear the faint hissing sound it made as it moved, like the sound of steam escaping from a pressure valve, and the water around the boat began to bubble as if it were boiling. My head was filled with thoughts. What was this thing? How had it gone unnoticed in a lake as popular as Tahoe? And most importantly, what did it want? The creature seemed to be studying me, as if trying to decide whether I was a threat or just another part of the landscape. Suddenly, the creature stopped circling and began to rise out of the water. Its head and upper body emerged fully, revealing long, powerful limbs ending in webbed claws. It was massive, easily twice the size of the boat, and it let out a low, rumbling growl that I could feel in my bones. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was terrified that any sudden movement would provoke it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I slowly reached for the ignition, praying that the engine would start on the first try. The creature's eyes narrowed as it watched me, its body tensing as if ready to strike. My fingers fumbled with the key, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I might drop it. But then the engine roared to life, shattering the tense silence. I slammed the throttle forward, and the boat lurched away from the creature, spraying water in all directions. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the water churning behind me, the creature giving chase. The boat's engine screamed as I pushed it to its limits, tearing across the lake toward the marina. The whole time I could feel the creature's presence, an overwhelming sense of something vast and ancient bearing down on me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the marina and pulled up to the dock, nearly crashing into it in my haste. I scrambled out of the boat, my legs shaking, and ran up the dock toward the lights of the marina office. Sam was inside, talking to one of the other workers, and they both turned to stare at me as I burst through the door, breathless and pale. "Jesus, kid, what happened?" Sam asked, his face a mix of concern and confusion. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. All I could manage was something about a creature in the lake, something big and dangerous. Sam's expression shifted from concern to disbelief, but there was something else there too, something that made me think he knew more than he was letting on. "Calm down," he said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "You probably just saw a big sturgeon. They can get pretty damn big in these waters, and in the low light—" "No," I interrupted, shaking my head. "This wasn't a fish, Sam. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be here." Sam's eyes flicked toward the other worker, who was now watching us closely, and then back to me. He sighed heavily and ran a hand through his hair. "All right, kid. Let's just say you saw something. Best not to go back to that spot, all right? There's places on this lake you just don't go, not if you know what's good for you." I wanted to press him for more answers, but the look on his face told me I wouldn't get any. Whatever I had seen, Sam wasn't about to talk about it, at least not then. He sent me home early that night, and I spent the next few days avoiding the lake altogether, trying to process what had happened. Over time, I heard whispers from the locals, stories about strange things seen in the water, tales of old legends that predated the settlers who came to Tahoe. Some said there were creatures in the lake, things that had been there for centuries, maybe even longer, but no one ever talked about it openly, and I got the sense that most people preferred to pretend those stories were just that, stories. But I knew better. I'd seen it with my own eyes. There was something in Lake Tahoe, something ancient and powerful, and it was still out there, lurking in the deep, waiting for its next encounter. Even now, I can't look at the lake the same way. I still love Tahoe, but the peace I used to feel when I looked out over the water is gone, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. If you ever find yourself out on the lake, especially in one of those quiet, secluded coves, keep your eyes open. You never know what might be watching you from beneath the surface. And if you see something that doesn't belong, don't stick around to find out what it is. Just get out of there and don't look back. Emily Hargrove had always felt most herself when she was out in nature. As an amateur photographer, she liked to spend her free days chasing after that perfect shot. This time, her work had taken her to a sprawling swamp that straddled the line between Georgia and Florida. It was a place most people wouldn't think twice about visiting, with its dense cypress trees, murky waters, and thick underbrush. But for Emily, it was like a treasure trove waiting to be explored. She set up her camp on a small patch of dry land, about a mile from the nearest dirt road. Her tent was pitched right by the water, which made it easy for her to hop into her kayak whenever she wanted. The swamp was alive with sound, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, and every so often, the distinct splash of an alligator sliding into the water. It was remote and quiet, just how Emily liked it. Out here, she could focus on her photography without any distractions from the modern world. That afternoon, she found herself drifting lazily in her kayak, camera ready in her hands. The sun was shining through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the water's surface. She had already snapped pictures of some great blue herons and a couple of raccoons she'd spotted near the shore. But Emily was hoping to find something special, something you didn't see every day. As she paddled deeper into the swamp, the trees closed in around her, their roots dipping into the water like gnarled hands. The deeper she went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of the swamp seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness. The air was cooler here, and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves was stronger. Emily stopped paddling and let her kayak drift, while she focused on a group of water lilies floating nearby. Just as she was about to take a picture, she heard a splash to her left, followed by the sound of something large moving through the water. She quickly turned, camera in hand, but saw nothing, just the still, dark water and the twisted roots of the trees. She waited, her heart racing a little. Whatever had made that noise was too big to be just a fish or a bird. It had to be something larger, something that didn't want to be seen. After a minute, she shrugged it off. The swamp was full of strange sounds, and she was used to them. It was probably just an alligator or a big turtle, nothing to worry about. The rest of the afternoon went by as Emily continued exploring the swamp. She snapped photos of anything that caught her eye, from the way the light hit the water to the wildlife she encountered. As the sun started to set, she paddled back to her campsite, satisfied with the day's work. She tied her kayak to a tree and stepped out, stretching her legs. She was tired but happy with the shots she'd gotten. Some of them were bound to turn out great. As the last traces of daylight disappeared, Emily settled into her camp for the night. She'd been out in the wild enough times to know the routine. Get a small fire going, cook something simple, and then sit back to enjoy the night sounds. But tonight felt different. There was an odd energy in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She brushed it off as just nerves. After all, she was alone in the middle of a swamp, surrounded by creatures most people wouldn't want to meet in the dark. But this was what she lived for, the solitude and the connection with nature that came with it. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. As she sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows around her camp, Emily heard it again, a splash in the water, louder this time, and closer. She froze, her eyes darting toward the sound. It wasn't unusual to hear things moving in the swamp at night, but this was different. It was deliberate, as if whatever it was wanted her to know it was there. Probably just a gator, she muttered to herself, trying to sound casual. The swamp around her seemed to grow quieter, the usual chorus of insects and frogs fading into an unsettling silence. She strained to listen, but all she could hear was normal sounds of the swamp. Suddenly, the water rippled, and she caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the edge of her camp. It was too dark to make out any details, but whatever it was big. Emily's instinct was to grab her camera, but another part of her, the part that had kept her safe on countless trips into the wild, told her to stay still and not move. Slowly, she reached for the flashlight clipped to her belt. She flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The light caught on something in the water. For a split second, she saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at her, wide, unblinking, and disturbingly human. But then, just as quickly as she'd seen them, they vanished beneath the surface with a soft splash. She nearly stopped breathing. That wasn't an animal. Not any animal she'd ever seen, at least. After a few long minutes, when nothing else happened, she slowly lowered the flashlight. Her hands were trembling slightly as she tried to focus on what to do next. The isolation, the darkness, the unfamiliar sounds, it could all easily mess with her head. Or maybe she was just overthinking after a long day of paddling and photographing. Trying to stay calm, Emily decided to pack up her gear. She wasn't going to stay out here tonight, not after that. She'd head back to the dirt road, even if it meant navigating the swamp in the dark. She'd done it before. She could do it again. But as she started packing, she heard it again. A faint ripple in the water, closer than before. Her hands moved faster, stuffing her camera and supplies into her backpack with urgency. She doused the fire, plunging the camp into darkness, and quickly grabbed her kayak. She pushed off into the water, paddling hard, her eyes constantly darting around the swamp. The beam from her flashlight cut through the night, illuminating only a small patch of the murky water ahead. The rest of the swamp remained shrouded in darkness, hiding whatever it was that had been watching her. Emily paddled hard. She didn't stop, didn't look back, not until she finally saw the faint outline of the dirt road ahead. Relief washed over her as she reached the shore, but it was quickly replaced by fear. She pulled the kayak onto the bank and collapsed beside it, trying to catch her breath. Whatever was out there, it had let her go. But why? Emily didn't have any answers, and she wasn't sure she wanted them. She knew one thing, though. She wasn't going back into that swamp, not alone and not at night. As she sat there on the dirt road, the first light of dawn beginning to break through the trees, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something ancient, something that belonged to the swamp in a way she never could. And as much as she loved capturing the untamed beauty of nature, she realized that some parts of the wild were better left unexplored, their secrets hidden in the darkness where they belonged.